Welcome to Sable Island Conference 2021, a series of virtual presentations about the natural wonders and human history of this fascinating island. Session 5, Insight into an Icon, Ecology of the Wild Horses of Sable Island, is being presented by Dr. Philip McLoughlin. I am April Hennigar, Chair of the Board of Directors for Friends of Sable Island, a volunteer-run charitable organization dedicated to the long-term protection of Sable Island. We have been holding a biannual Sable Island Conference since 2015 as a major fundraiser for our education programs and especially our annual scholarships. We had hoped to hold an in-person conference in 2021, but when this proved too difficult, we chose to present it virtually instead. The Sable Island Horse is arguably an international icon and full of mysteries. How did they really get to the sandbar in the North Atlantic Ocean over 300 kilometers from the mainland of Canada? Why do some people call them ponies and others horses? How do they survive without help from humans? What can they teach us? Dr. Philip McLoughlin will provide an update on his ongoing research on the Sable Island horse. Philip McLoughlin is a professor in the Department of Biology at the University of Saskatchewan. His research program focuses on the population ecology of large mammals. Through this work, he contributes to our understanding and conservation of species from across Canada. He has been studying the Sable Island horse as a model species of Canadian wildlife since 2007. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. McLoughlin as a presenter at our virtual conference. Over to you, Phil.
Well, thanks, April, and hi, everyone, and thanks for joining. It's certainly my pleasure to give a presentation to the Friends of Sable Island. It's and I'm going to start off here just talking a little bit about our program, our long-term research program. It's kind of run out of the University of Saskatchewan, but has really branched out to multiple universities over the last 15 or so years now. And the objectives of this program, what we've been doing, what we've been learning, why it's important. I called this talk Insight into an Icon, and the icon, I would say, is not so much just the Sable Island horse. It's feral horses in general, worldwide, because what we're learning on Sable Island about the horses there, it really does apply to our understanding of feral horses throughout the world, but even beyond that, into the horse as a species, the equine veterinary science that we're learning from this model, if you want to call it that, of the Sable Island horse, and then even in terms of wildlife and large mammals, the species that I work on, the Sable Island horse really is a representative species, and that probably speaks to why I was first interested in coming to Sable Island back in, I think, 2007. And really why I think the Sable Island horse has, from an academic perspective, has really garnered a lot of attention from multiple different universities. My main partners at University of Calgary, University of Exeter, but also government agencies. It's now a national park, so there's a mandate there from Parks Canada, and just as an attractant for students and colleagues interested in understanding the ecology, the evolution of wildlife species, and then how this might have some practical applications to management, conservation of wildlife, and equine veterinary science. So this is actually an old version of my thank you credit slide. There are so many people involved in this program over the years that I definitely have to update this. But anyways, thank you for having me. And again, I first came to Sable Island and Debbie, you might remember this outfit here, but yeah, this is 2007. Maybe this was 2009 because I was here a little bit earlier. It looks like it's spring, but yeah, I came out to Sable Island and established a research lab that has grown to maybe around 10 students or so. Some of these people might be familiar to those of you that I don't know who's on the call right now, but have been on the Sable Island. But there's Ruth Gruel, there's Kirsten Johnson, there's Julie Colpitt, some of my students. This was where my lab is kind of right now at the University of Saskatchewan. But like I said, the number of us working on the questions in both applied and I guess a more fundamental ecology of Sable Island horses is really expanded to other labs as well. This is a professor in the University of Calgary, Jocelyn Poisson. He was one of my postdocs. He since became a professor and is working in the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine, University of Calgary, and has a number of students working on the Sable Island horses. This is University of Exeter in England, Professor Alistair Wilson, who annually we have a student come from the UK to work on Sable Island horse. And we have a few other labs as well. At the University of Saskatchewan, we have the Western College of Veterinary Medicine. This is one of my colleagues, Emily Jenkins, who has been, and I'm not really going to speak too much about her work just out of time here, but she is a parasitologist working in veterinary microbiology and has been helping us understand the special place that the Sable Island horse has in terms of equine veterinary science and understanding things like parasitology. And I'll speak about the special role of the horse in a maybe near the end of, in terms of equine veterinary science, at the end of the call. But I'll just give you a little bit of a heads up that we've come to realize that the Sable Island horse, just by virtue of its isolation and its history of no modern equine veterinary care for all the descendants and all of the ancestors of this population, that we have a very special population for understanding how horses can deal with parasites and pathogens without antibiotics, without anti-helmintic drugs, and without antibiotic resistance is part of the how they deal with infections. So it's a very special population we're increasingly understanding worldwide. We don't really know of any other feral horse population that is like that. But like I said, this has been really branched out into an international effort. If you were to go onto Sable Island during the field season, this might be a typical year where you'll have representatives from multiple countries and Quebec is within Canada as well. So it's a really if you come into our lab, there'll be a mix of accents. And this has since expanded to my student that'll be on to Sable Island this next summer coming up. This is Anastasia, literally coming from the Ukraine just on February 10th, and is lucky to escape the conflict there. But we've been trying to get her out for a while with COVID, but she'll be my PhD student this summer coming up, along with a number of other students. So here we are on Sable Island, and of course, you guys all know where Sable Island is. Stole some of these slides from some of my other talks, but this is really where since 2007, I've kind of came onto the island, and from a background in population ecology, really trying to understand how wildlife populations work. And Sable Island is very special in the sense you have a large mammal there that is completely unmanaged, and so it's free from human interference. It's also somewhat isolated from other interactions like predation or competition with other herbivores. Aside from the the odd bat that might show up on Sable Island, it's the only mammal, and they're relatively easy to keep track of in terms of their markings. And so we've really focused on this population as a model to study the dynamics of a large mammal when it's dealing with mostly interactions that are occurring within the species. Um, so competition within the species, and then without almost isolated from some of these other effects. I always tell my students that ecology as a discipline, it's really messy. There's so many different interactions that happen. You've got predators, prey, other competitors, and it's tough to get insight into what might say drive the dynamics of a population when you have so many. But what if, what's the year like, what's the predator density like? And so Sable Island is a very unique system where we can isolate the dynamics of populations, and by tracking every individual in the population, which is what we do, we are able to look at their contribution to how the population might grow over time in terms of an individual's births, its survival, its reproduction. We can decompose population dynamics into the contributions of individuals, and then you could look at, why are some individuals more successful at surviving or reproducing than others, and what is it about the where they live, or some of the traits they may have. What is it about the environment in which they're in a certain year? Maybe some years some horses do better than others, and it's very, very complicated. When we're isolating from other interactions, we can really drill down and understand what really makes a wildlife population like the feral horses tick. So we have a really large program. It's individual based, and so that for every summer we will locate horses, identify if they've survived or died over the winter. We have a resighting probability of 100%. So if a horse is missing from our census, we know that it's dead. So all sorts of things that we collect. We collect feces from every horse. We swab that for DNA, so we have genetic pedigree. We also annually, or every day at the end of our survey season, feces that are collected, we collect data on the parasites and a number of other variables. We measure the horses, and we really do keep good tabs on what is making the population tick. So we have somewhere around 1,300 life histories now in our database, and about 98% of the horses that are on Sable Island right now have been born since 2006. So when I first came out onto 2007, we could tell if a horse was a 3-year-old or a 2-year-old or a 1-year-old, or like a foal, 1-year-old and full in our photographic database. So we knew what year those horses were, and there's just very few that are now left alive that were adults of age 4+ when I first arrived on Sable Island. So we have almost a complete knowledge now of the entire history of the population since 2007. And I always like to use this photo. This is one of the first stallions that I photographed. I think it was day one in 2007 on Sable Island. The horses truly are a model to understand in a non-invasive way the dynamics, because you can get relatively close. We used to get much closer than the 20-meter rule, but each one will be identifiable from markings, maybe not so much the stars and snips that might be hidden quite a bit, but all of the chestnuts on the legs are unique fingerprints, or just the muzzle and the whiskers and whisker patterns, things like this, that you can use computers to help identify which horse is which. We're really good now at identifying horses, and we have a system where we survey these horses over time. We also collect a lot of data on the vegetation on the island. So we had a series of plots. There's around 500 plots that we maintain on the island, and we've been monitoring this over changes in vegetation over the last 15 years. We map water sources for the horses. We have, some of you might know this, that the west side of the island, has some ponds that are permanent, and then on the east side of the island, the horses must dig down to the water table in order to obtain water. This presents a really interesting gradient on Sable Island to understand things like what might limit a population. So we think on the west side, it's mostly a vegetation type of limitation, the amount of forage that's there. But on the east side, water trumps vegetation, and that's really what is limiting the population. So it's a really neat dichotomy from one side of the island to the next along this gradient that filters down into everything from the social dynamics, the band sizes that are there, but even the parasite loads and the growth rates of the population. We've been tracking population growth rate across the island. You can see how it first fills up in the west and then spills over into the east, and then it fills up into the east. And so you have this great picture of how a population might grow when presented with different resources that might be available to it. So here's now this is a photo from before the 20-meter rule, of course. This is must have been 2008. You can see how the horses will dig down to the water table. But we keep track of a lot of everything from the genetics for our pedigree, but also in terms of coloration patterns and things like this. We know that there's around 11 coat phenotypes on Sable Island. Some of them are actually quite rare. You've got the wild bay pattern, and just understanding all sorts of different links between, say, the behavior of horses, whether or not they're bold or they are shy, and how this might relate to horse coloration patterns and the genetics behind that. There's all sorts of different things we can study and understand just by non-invasively watching horses with a notepad and a pen and paper and a camera. Speaking of cameras, we also measure the horses. And this is a contraption that I built in early on in the program, when it was really clear that although you can get fairly close to the horses without them being afraid of you and running away, they just a second, I've got to put on pause. Listen, I'm on a talk, honey.
I'm just gonna say, where's the charger? Because I need
It's upstairs. Go talk to Mama and close the door. Sorry about that. So yeah, so these are laser gun sights, believe it or not. These are green laser gun sights that I've hooked onto a box here, and then we have a camera, and we have the distance of these sites measured at exactly, I think it's 19.1 centimeters or something like that. And so it's a parallel laser. And then when we shine it onto a horse, we will have, I wonder if you can actually see that on here. You might not see the green dots here, but you will, you'll have a reference plane there, and you know that at that point that's 19.1 centimeters, and then you can do in almost in the it's manipulated a little bit by how wide the barrel is, but you get some pretty good measurements, especially when you shine it here, from the height at the withers, for example. And you get you can collect a lot of information on growth rates of animals in different parts of the island, skeletal growth. We also collect body condition data, and so we keep track of how this might change over time, whether an animal's pregnant or not. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, we're able to track the population size and how it has grown. So this is a plot that we put together based on historical whole island counts of Sable Island horses, which goes right back to the 1960s and the days of Daniel Welsh. And then we've got, you can see from this some booms and busts for the population. We have some gaps in the data set. We do have an air photo count, though, from late 2003 or early 2004 that was classified as having a pretty low period for the population. I think this is why today we don't have a lot of really old horses. We know that they could live to be, around 29 years old. I think that was Daniel Welsh had seen that in his stallions, 29, 26 years old mares in his data set back here. But something happened in that early 2000s led to a crash. So not a lot of animals survived that, but they've since rebounded and come back, and they're now hovering at a really high density relative to historical estimates going right back to records in the late 1700s, early 1800s. We're at historically high estimates. So we can learn a lot from this population. And this is, as a population ecologist, I always get questioned, why am I studying Sable Island horses? I'm University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon. I think Saskatoon might be as far from the ocean as is possible in North America. I could be wrong at that, but anyways, we're a long ways from the ocean. Why are we studying Sable Island horses? And I think a lot of that comes back to just the questions that I've been interested in, which go back to studying species like prior to Sable Island, I was working in the UK on a population of red deer on the Isle of Rum in Scotland. But just going back to, there's very limited systems on the planet in which you can have a setup for a large mammal like the Sable Island horse. And this is why it's so special, so we can understand the population ecology and evolution of these species that are in isolation. This is a very famous population from the red deer on the Isle of Rum in Scotland. This is a long-term population from population study since the 1960s run out of University of Cambridge. And I think 1 in 10 of those papers produced by that system over the last few years, over the last 40 years or so, has been published in Nature. There's a few other similar programs like this, but they're very rare. It's really hard to maintain a long-term program that's truly free of interference and rounding up of animals or harvest or something like this. So Sable Island is very, very special worldwide in that respect. So I've been interested in a lot of things. Everything from the evolution of these species. In this case here, we're looking at, in terms of red deer, density related changes in sexual selection. The same thing happens on Sable Island, just a little bit differently. We're interested in how the number of males versus females in a population might influence what is born in a particular year, which is of real conservation concern for smaller populations like rhinos. We're interested in some basic understanding of how evolution proceeds, and we can track this in the Sable Island horses. We're also interested in the horse because it has such a unique social system relative to other ungulates, hoofed mammals, in that, if anything, they're more like a primate social system where you have a family band or family group that is led by a stallion, or maybe there's a couple stallions in there, and then it's a harem of females and their offspring. And then you'll have a bachelor group of unpaired males, and you'll have females that will disperse first, and then you'll have males will spend their early life in a bachelor group, and then they'll fight for a band. That social system is, you see it in zebras, and you see it in wild asses, donkeys, things like that. But amongst the other ungulates like red deer, you don't see that at all. If anything, the horse social system is much more primate-like. And so here we have an isolated primate-like social system in this idealized model environment where we can study things like inbreeding depression. So if you have isolation, what does this mean for the health of a population over time? And horses on Sable Island are notably inbred, but yet they can still grow at really fast population growth rates. You saw that graph there where they had bumped up from 138 horses to well over 500. I think we peaked out at 575, I think. So what does that mean for how inbreeding might take place. And why is that important is because we have already there a model for other species with similar social systems, and mountain gorillas are a really good example of some social system that is almost identical to that of the feral horse. And many of our primate populations, large primate populations, are isolated. Maybe you're talking about, Virunga Mountain gorillas in Rwanda that you have around 500 animals, the same as on Sable Island. And so the dynamics that occur on Sable Island it really does apply to other species. Of course, the social system is absolutely cool and fascinating to understand just on its basic level. So we have a number of projects on the island where we're looking at how the social system is established in different parts of the island. What regulates it? Is it based on what resources are available? What happens when the sex ratio changes? We have, say, more males and females in an area. And what does this mean overall for how the population can continue to grow or decline? So there's lots of things that we're studying at almost the base unit of the individual, how the behaviors of individuals, dominance hierarchies, things like this that occur within the band unit. How does that translate into, say, band productivity, and then ultimately population growth, and ultimately, at the end of the day, the passing on of genes to the next generation? So a couple of things that we've been learning as this population has grown is that females really do bear the cost of reproduction more than males, which might be surprising compared to other species like elk or red deer, where it's usually the males that don't live as long as the females. And at high density, you'll have a lot more females in a population than you would males because of that. They just can't make it through the winter. On Sable Island, as the population has increased, we see that the males are surviving, the females are not. So we right now have somewhere around 65% males in the adult population, compared to when I first started the study, which is more of a 50-50 sex ratio. Why is that? Lots of questions. Probably has a lot to do with the difference in body size between horses and, say, other species. Horses, the males and females, are relatively the same size. The females also, they do undergo a lot of costs of dispersal that the males don't. And we know this from species like zebra, but I'm not going to bore you with too much details here, but we have a lot of really good data here showing that as population size increases, as the females are more likely to die than males because of the cost of reproduction, which is reflected in parasite loads, we get a reduction in the reproductive capacity of females. So here's a graph here showing that if you, say, have on the left side of the graph over on here, this is a recent paper. So you have, say, more females than males in the population. If you're less than 0.5 here, all the females are reproducing at relatively rates. 75% of your adult females are having a foal. But then as you end up getting to where we are today, all of a sudden the 3-year-old females don't reproduce at all, and you have the adults as well have fewer offspring. And then if you're to look at what that means for the band sizes, you'll see that the number of bands increases as population size increases. You might expect that, but at lower sex rates, it kind of stays the same, then it increases. What we think is happening is you get many more smaller bands. And this is because the social system is disrupted and the stallions just can't keep each other out. And so you end up with a really, I would say right now on Sable Island is a fairly chaotic in terms of the social system. There's a lot of males, not many females. And so we've started to notice a number of interesting patterns. So for example, females will they'll give birth to a male or a female, but they tend to favor their female offspring more than males in terms of providing resources. We think they survive, the female offspring in a band in this environment will survive at a better rate than will the males. And we think it's because the females are favoring the mares are favoring their female offspring more than males. And this might correct the sex ratio in the future. We don't know, but this is an interesting dynamic that we didn't know could occur, and we didn't know it could occur in other species as well. But this is just one example of insight into how populations might function under the situations we find at Sable Island. So, like I say, I always say that the study of our program on Sable Island is about much more than just what is going on Sable Island, because everything we study there has some sort of application to other species and other environments. And I'm just going to take a slight detour here just to tell you a little bit about how the work that we've been studying on Sable Island applies to other feral horse populations. There's one that I've been working with recently in Alberta, a growing population of feral horses that is in a completely different environment. Here you have the feral horse mixed in with grizzly bears and black bears and cougars and all sorts of other species in which it competes with, but it's doing exceptionally well. We think what is happening, if you were to, I'm just going to jump forward here real quick, to the horse population, which can grow at rates, the same rate of growth that we see on Sable Island. We think what is happening there is that the horses have this competitive advantage to other species, whether on Sable Island, we've isolated those advantages and some of the quirkiness of, I guess, the dynamics, but off Sable Island, they also have advantages. In particular, we think that horses are carrying with them into new environments some signals of domestication and artificial selection for earlier reproduction than you might expect for a really large animal. They're quite competitive, and they are, because they're large animals. And so there's a number of different horse populations across the world that are feral, that are doing really well and growing as fast as Sable Island horses. And why that is the case, we know that horse dynamics are different, but how different is something that we're trying to understand. So these are feral horses from France. This is the Khmer feral horse. You see white horses running on the beach. Those sometimes in calendars, those are the famous Khmer horses. But what we can tell is that just like on Sable Island, unlike, say, a species like a moose or a deer, the females will continue to reproduce even at high densities when they probably shouldn't, and they'll just push the boundaries, and it'll lead to high mortality at the end of the day, but will allow the population to grow at very, very fast growth rates. And this is something that you don't expect so I guess the take-home point to this that I tell everyone is that horses are different from other species. And if you're trying to manage, say, a horse like an elk in another environment, it's not going to work. Horses are quite different. There are a few things that we've learned from Sable Island that apply to our understanding of horses in other environments, like habitat selection. So we've been studying horses in Alberta for a while. There we can actually collar our horses. They're treated as wildlife. And so it's not we can be a little bit more invasive. You know, we collar a lot of species, moose and deer, a number of programs right now. We also collar horses in Alberta. And so we're able to track their habitat selection using GPS tracking collars in much more detail than what we can get on Sable Island. But I would say that what we've learned and what we can expect for those dynamics of other feral horse species is really derived a lot from what we've learned with the system on Sable Island, where we also study habitat selection. This is a recent paper, maybe not so recent anymore, but for example, we were able to understand that as the population size on Sable Island has increased, the horses, in terms of the species, the plants they eat, or where they go to eat, more precisely, they become much more generalized in their diet and their place of movement. You can almost think of as a population increases, and competition intensifies, that the horses are kind of moving around much more to try and make a living. And we showed that happened on Sable Island. And so when we go back to Alberta and we can see how that population still has a long ways in which to grow, we can make predictions about where they're going to go next. And we know that they're going to start to diversify and move out of their current haunts into other areas, but where and when is a big question for management in Alberta. There's somewhere around 2,000 horses or so on the landscape right now, whereas maybe 15 years ago there's 500. So it's a big management question. There are a few other things that we've learned of our study on Sable Island that is, I guess, more wide-ranging impact in terms of our understanding of ecology off of Sable Island. One of the really important things we've come to understand is that even though Sable Island is an island, it is part of the marine ecosystem on the Scotian Shelf. There's a lot of ways in which different systems can be linked to each other. And in this case, we know that there's a link between the ocean onto land that comes from seabirds and seals to influence the dynamics of the horses. So for example, this is maybe not the best graph here, but if you were to say plot the number of horses on Sable Island versus the number of seal pups on Sable Island, there's a relationship there. This is maybe a better one. Where you look at, we're at historically high numbers of horses on Sable Island. We're also at historically high numbers of gray seals, which pup on Sable Island in the winter. So maybe going from just a few thousand gray seals in the 1960s to somewhere around 400,000 today, that we've got this strong relationship here that seems to be affecting the carrying capacity of the island, which is really interesting because this is a fascinating topic of ecology, where you can link say an ocean system to a terrestrial system, of sea to the land, and the dynamics of species. There's a few areas in which you can see this, and there have been a number of papers on this. Maybe you're looking at say how sea turtles might nest on an area and affect the dune vegetation, or you might be looking at seabird effects on vegetation. But on Sable Island, we're actually showing some influences on not just the vegetation, but then on the animals that feed on that vegetation, being the horses. So Sable Island has all these gray seals. I'm sure you know about this from other talks, and they pup on the island in winter, and you'll find them all over the island, but not everywhere. Some areas are don't have seals, slopey areas, more of the high elevations, but you'll typically find colonies that are adding a lot of nitrogen to the island. And if you were to go to Sable Island, there's one thing that might stand out, and this is where you have, say, the west spit of Sable Island, where there's really high density of seals in the winter time, and at the same time there, and then you come in the summertime, you'll see really lush vegetation. And this spit on Sable Island, if you were to go there, say in July 20th in a year, you might find as many as 170 horses just on that green plot of vegetation there. And they're just chowing down on the beach pea, but also some of the other species, the sandwort that is there. And we've looked at the contents of this vegetation. We can tell that it's high in nitrogen. The beach pea fixes nitrogen as well, but it's the nitrogen that we've tracked into this area has come from the ocean. We can tell this from what's called a stable isotope analysis, that it's a sea to land nutrient transfer of nitrogen. And it's really apparent here. And we think this is one reason why the horse population is perhaps doing as well as it's ever done on the island, and why it can bounce back so quickly from, say, a population reduction, more than it ever did historically with the records that we have. We also can tell that horses prefer areas that are fertilized. So in this plot here, this is basically, if you see two things together, that means they're really highly correlated to each other. So you can see that if an area has seals in it, has a high nitrogen enrichment. There's lots of seals there, but also this is also where the horses browse more compared to other areas. And so this is quite interesting because there hasn't been too many systems in which we are able to show things like the influence of one species on another to affect its behavior. But we know across the planet that some species play really important roles in the structuring of entire ecosystems. So, for example, if we were to go to Yellowstone National Park, we know that with the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone National Park, we had a major change in the herbivores. So wolves were reintroduced into the park in 1995 when I was a grad student, and that reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone National Park has completely restructured the system because the elk are afraid to live in certain areas. We've had a reduction in elk, so they're not browsing on the species that are around there so much. You've got the willows, which has allowed for beavers to come back, and songbirds. And there's a whole thing, we call it a trophic cascade in ecology, where you've got some influential species like a wolf in this case here to fundamentally change the structure of an entire ecosystem by its presence or its absence. And I mentioned that it's the behavior of behavior of wolves that have affected the behavior of elk. This is very similar to what we find on Sable Island, where it's the presence of seals and where they spend their time in winter that affects the behavior of where you spend your time as a horse on Sable Island. So there's definitely parallels there. There are other parallels here to that the Yellowstone kind of situation where you have this trophic cascade, some overarching effect of a single species on that kind of cascades down to affect other populations. On Sable Island, we know that the gray seals are doing particularly well, and they have for a long time. And this is a paper in Science from a few years ago that was looking at what happened. Why do we have so many gray seals? And if you could think of that presence or absence of a major predator affecting the system, don't look to the seals. You have to look to us. And this is where some of our research is heading, is just getting an appreciation of the place of Sable Island in the Scotian Health ecosystem, and not just the place of the horses or seals or their prey and predators, but also us. And if you go back, and I'm sure this is well within everyone's memory and recollection of the collapse of the cod fishery in the late 1990s. This is what I give my lectures in at the university on this quite a bit. I always bring up the story of the Sable Island horse as being linked to this fisheries collapse from the 1990s, because when we had the loss of the codfish, which was actually declining for quite a while, we went from the relatively large amount of fish being hauled in, and then we had this explosion in activity with the advent of better boats, and then we had an absolute collapse and then the decline. One of the beneficiaries of that collapse in the cod, which is a major prey species, has been smaller prey, lobster, shellfish, but also sand lance. We had that movement from these types of boats to these types of boats, and just the collapse of the cod fishery has released a lot of those prey species. And this is really what the gray seals have benefited from, as well as the terns and other species on Sable Island. So we think that there's a link there. It might also be related to climate change, on how the Sable Island system right now is able to support almost twice as many horses as it has historically. And understanding those links and showing that, demonstrating those kind of multi-food web food dynamics, where you go from the ocean to the land. This is something that we can do on Sable Island, but it has a lot of implications for our understanding of worldwide ecology and ecological questions around ocean to land dynamics. Or you can look at parallels to wolves in Yellowstone National Park, that whole idea of a trophic cascade. So this is where a lot of our work is going right now. We do have a study working with the Parks Canada and Sable Island Institute and a few other universities on that place of the horse on Sable Island, where when we have this sea to land nutrient transfer, but maybe we exclude horses, how is the vegetation responding? Lots of really interesting questions there. This is an electric fence that is up on the island right now. Oops, sorry, I went the wrong way. And so we're working on this. There's lots of questions about the role of the horse in this system and whether the plants will respond to this. I'm more interested in how does the system react to the absence of horses, knowing, as I know, about how the horse will selectively at low density forage on really palatable species. I think a lot of folks don't realize that maybe a third of the plants on Sable Island are exotic, and some of them are quite invasive, a threat to other plant species, native plant species, hay species, timothy, or Kentucky bluegrass, those types of species. When you take the horse out of the system, what does that mean for those systems? But at the same time, what does that mean for seabirds and nesting habitat? We know that horses are a disturbance agent. I always think of them as a keystone predator of plants. So we have lots of questions here that we're hoping to ask with some of these exclosures. And then just to finish off here, if I could just impress one more thing on you about the place of the Sable Island horse and why it's so important for Canada and for the world, is just as this model of equine veterinary science. We know that these horses have really special flora in their guts that have not been subjected to antibiotics before. And you've probably heard of antibiotic resistance and the issues that it might pose for not just horses, but human health. Our more recent work on this topic is showing that there are a potential source for developing new antibiotics from the bacteria that are present in Sable Island horses that isolating. We're always looking for new sources of antibiotics, and because of antibiotic resistance everywhere worldwide, there's not that many places to look, but we have something in the Sable Island horse, different species of bacteria that University of Calgary is looking towards in terms of potentially down the line, not just understanding how healthy guts work and can fend off infections, but how potentially we might be able to resolve some new antibiotics for humans from what we find in Sable Island horses. So there's still a lot to go in terms of our research program. It's very wide ranging, but if anything I could impress on you with the talk today is that they are special, and they're special to many different reasons. So I think this is really where we're at right now. It's a very exciting time to be working on Sable Island, and hope to continue to do so into the future. So with that, that's my last slide. I know I've kind of gone over time here, but I didn't count my slides, April, I'm sorry. There were 72.
Oh, yes. Oh, Phil, thank you so much for sharing your research and enthusiasm for the mysteries of Sable Island and its horses. For those watching the recording, if you like if you enjoyed this presentation, please consider a small charitable donation towards our scholarship program. For those attending the live session, we will stop recording now and take some questions and hear some personal stories.